So I'm Henri, I'm from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and we're the business-led group that seek to make the case for the rebalancing of the country. But we also include civic leaders and voices from civic society. So we're quite an unusual institution, I suppose. And we were set up very explicitly as supporters of the devolution model. Our initial chair was George Osborne. Our current chair is Jim O'Neill, who was commercial secretary for a time in the then what was the government, Tory government that came out of the coalition government, but we're a cross-party institution, and I happen to be an ex-Labour politician, which is partly a bit why I know Jessie as well. So I think my kind of reflections would be that, hi Claire, it's nice to see you. It's normally me that does your bit, no. So I'm normally there. I'm so sorry, my train's late person, so it's nice someone else got to do that today. So I think my kind of first kind of reflection, what Andy had to say, was that I think tax and spending power are really closely related together. And I think one of the problems and one of the deficits in this country is, at the moment, many of you pay a lot of council tax now, particularly if you live in a more deprived part of the country, to pick up what Andy was saying about local spending power. But almost none of the decisions about your local services are related to how much you pay, because basically you pay more in the more deprived area you live, and your local authority can spend more or less in inverse proportion to how deprived you are, if that makes sense. So the more deprived your local authority, if you're in Middlesbrough, for example, they've not done anything particularly wrong, and Jessie knows that part of the country obviously very well, but they have no money to spend on anything other than keeping kids alive and keeping old people in a level of care that they can almost just afford. That is what they do. They cannot spend money on anything else. And that is a massive democratic deficit, because I pay taxes in the great city of Bradford to keep kids alive, bluntly. That's what I'm paying my money for. But that has no relationship to the services I receive. And that's a pretty big deficit, right? Which is the biggest choice a local authority has over its budget. As a former local councillor, it was the most important thing I was responsible for doing when I was in the cabinet in Newcastle. And I had some choice about where the cuts would fall back in the first part of the coalition government. But local councillors and leaders now have almost no power on where the democratic kind of priority should be, because they can only do the things that are absolutely essential. And we're now at the point where nothing else is getting any money at all, bluntly. Does that make sense? Unless it's a statutory service, and it will be run on a shoestring still in most cases, nothing will happen in that local authority, other than the things that have to be paid for. That is a democratic issue, because local government doesn't work anymore. When you don't have the ability to raise money because you're capped to pay for things that local people want, then the local public state has ceased to work. And that's why I completely agree with Andy. I want fiscal devolution, right? I want to retain national insurance to pay for transport. I want all these other whiz-bang things. I'm a big proponent. We did a report last year on tourism tax, and I'm really glad that Andy is such a strong supporter of it. It exists in a kind of trial form in Manchester already, and it is a really positive intervention. But those are marginal issues, sadly, compared to the fact that local government finance is broken. And until you introduce a very radical reform of council tax, we're in favour of anything that's better than this. Local revaluation, super bans. Why is it that someone in Chelsea spends like nothing as a proportion of the house price on council tax? Someone in Salford is paying in an 80 grand flat about 2% the value of their house or flat every year in tax. How is that fair? It's not fair. Council tax is the most regressive tax in Britain. I mean, you talk about VAT being bad. Poor people spend an even worse proportion of their income actually on council tax if you work it out, compared to the most wealthy and the least wealthy. So even compared to VAT, it's regressive. That's horrendous to have a property tax that is actually a regressive tax. How could we have ever allowed ourselves to have allowed the council tax system to get so far out of control? So I absolutely agree with Andy that we need the devolution project to continue. As Gordon Brown argued, in a Labour Party context, I think it's absolutely right that we to continue with what has been built. And there are lots of people, and I was one of them, right, who were in favour of regional assemblies under a Labour government. The reality is that was a long time ago now, and the world has moved on. And the world has moved on to the extent that we've now established the fact that there are people who are well known and trusted by their populations and who have a direct mandate. And the reason why Andy Burnham exists is that Greater Manchester wanted powers, but they were not prepared to give them to Sir Richard Leese, the then leader of Manchester, who was elected by a few hundred people in Burnage. Central government just wouldn't cede power to a group of local authorities. So they gave it to a group of local authorities and one directly elected person. Andy is just one among equals, right? The Greater Manchester Combined Authority includes every leader in Greater Manchester. They all have a seat around the table. It is not the majoritarianism of the extreme mayoral models of, say, the US. It's a completely different model. Actually, the London mayoral model has some real challenges. If you got the wrong person as London mayor, I have no problem with the existing mayor, I agree with them about lots of things, you could have real trouble in London because the checks and balances are not the same. Whereas in the mayoral model in England, you are one among equals as a mayor, bluntly, and most powers are equally dispersed. So in reality, the vote of Andy Burnham is worth the same as the leader of Bury, the leader of Oldham, bluntly, around that table. And he chairs those meetings, but he has to bring those people with him. What I would argue, I suppose, is that I don't think any of the things I'm arguing for, we need to sort out council tax, we need to introduce some local taxes, we need to start decentralising central government taxes. These are not particularly wild or exciting proposals, but they are like really basic things you could do, even in a period of real financial constraints, to make the current terrible system we have in terms of how we fund investment in our long-term needs, both locally and nationally, marginally better. And I don't think that's a very exciting thing to come and offer you. I don't think doing anything else is really sensible until we sort out these really impending crises. The big grand reforms of how you could have a genuinely federal Britain, of which I'm not a particular kind of critic, they're just not going to happen. So I'm in the business of what I can do now, because I want kids in Bradford to be safe and I want people in big cities to be able to get a bus to work. It's not a lot to ask. At the moment, it doesn't happen. And we've got to fix those things before we try and have a debate about what the ideal state might be for Britain and for England in particular, because the English state is the most broken part of our national puzzle. And if we can't fix that, we're going to really struggle to reconnect people with decision making, because at the moment, local democracy doesn't work because central government doesn't let it work. We need to fix that if we want to reconnect people to politics, because my experience in local government was that if you want to reconnect people to seeing the impact that their decisions and their preferences can make in their everyday lives, it's the best place to do it. At the moment, we've broken one of the most important connections between people and democracy, which is local democracy. It doesn't work at the moment because of how we fund it. We've got to fix that problem. And whether you want electoral reform in local government, anything else, they're all great ideas. But until local government actually has any discretion to do anything, it sadly doesn't matter to me how we elect those people, because at the moment you could elect anyone in local authorities to run your council. It would make almost no difference to the decisions, because in reality, people have no choices left at all to make. So not very uplifting.
Wow.
There you go.
But yeah, thank you. I think given us a lot to think about there, and a lot of challenge as well. I'm going to come to Miriam, who's the former chief exec at Engage Britain and is now with Demos. And I guess your work in thinking about communities and power from I guess a very grassroots citizen level. What's your thoughts on either what Henri said or Andy said, and what were you kind of reflecting on listening to those sort of provocations and challenges?
Thank you. Yeah, I do want to respond to all of that, but what I really want to start with is the question that you posed me when we were kind of planning this session, which is, can devolution work without devolving power to people? Yeah, of course it can. Like we've just heard from Andy Burnham, we've heard from Henri, devolution, there's a lot good about it. There's a lot about transferring power from Westminster to local areas that is working really well. But could devolution work better? Could it produce better outcomes for people, for places, if we transferred real power to people and to communities and to neighbourhoods? Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I think that is because who knows their place best? Who knows its needs? Who knows its assets, other than the people who live there and work there, spend all their time in those places? But most of us feel really disconnected kind of from the political decisions that affect our locality, let alone the country that we live in. We know this, we're the democracy sector, right? We kind of trade in these statistics all the time about how disenfranchised people feel, how disempowered they feel. But these things matter. This is a massive problem. And I think kind of the democratic deficit that Andy Burnham was just talking about, this is something that we have to look at more closely. So people don't feel like they have any sense of agency over the decisions that affect their lives. There is a declining trust in politics, in politicians, in our political institutions. And that's a real threat to the future of our democracy that I think we, particularly in the democracy sector, but everywhere, have a duty to fight against that with everything we've got to kind of enable people to flex their democratic muscles. So UCL Constitution Unit did a really interesting survey over the last couple of years. They found that 40% of people are not satisfied with the way democracy runs in the in the UK. 77% of people think that people like them have too little influence on how the UK is governed. But actually, there's some really interesting nuance in those and other kind of polling figures. So the Office for National Statistics, their 2022 Trust in Government survey, found that while trust is low across the board, people have increasing levels of trust as government gets closer to where they live. So only 35% of the UK population stated that they trust national government, but 42% trust local government. I mean, 42%, it's not great, right? This is the place that kind of brings democracy closest to us at the moment. But there's something in there that means that local's a good place to start if you want to revitalise our democracy. What this means is that if people have more trust in their local democracy than in national and want to exercise their power, then devolving power close to them, it's got to be the way to go. There's another bit of data that actually gives me quite a lot of hope. So the Community Life Survey that the government runs, it's a national survey, it showed that only 27% of people feel able to influence decisions in their neighbourhood, but 53% of people think it's important to do so. And that 27% gap, that's where I feel like there's some hope, that if you give people power, if you find the mechanisms to enable them to kind of flex their muscles, they're going to show up, they're going to take part, they're going to get involved. And getting involved on issues on your doorstep, where you can see and feel the real difference that makes. It's like a gateway drug to greater political engagement. Because most people's, and I know it's true for me, most of people's political engagement starts with the things that are really close to home. A local campaign to stop a local hospital closure, to start a food bank, to stop a planning application, to open a new park, both the positive and the negative of kind of local action and local campaigning. And our political system should be crying out for people who want to get involved and on that level and like take to the streets and write the letters and sign the petitions and generate the campaigns and do the organising on a local level, rather than seeing it as a bit of a threat or a bit of a bother. Like some local councils, I am naming no names, but where I live. And it's really difficult to get involved at that point if you've got the people who do have a little bit of power kind of not enabling you to kind of use that power and get involved. So the question is for me, kind of what can devolution that puts power in the hands of people actually look like so they can make and influence decisions in their local area? So I think there's a range of things. It's not simple, it's not easy, it's not quick, but we have to get on with it. Citizens' assemblies, obvious place to start, but citizens' assemblies that set the local agenda, are involved in budget setting, can deliberate on priority issues like meeting local net zero targets or land use planning. Citizens' audits of council decisions and delivery to hold the local authority to account. Potentially more town and parish councils to bring kind of those democratic structures as close to the neighbourhood level as possible. And co-design and delivery of local services or user involvement in procurement. So the services that are designed and delivered are the ones that people really want and need, that are actually going to meet their needs, rather than kind of agendas that are being set from further away. And lastly, trials like shifting resources directly into the hands of local people. So Local Trust gave 150 communities across the country £1 million to spend over 10 to 15 years, not just giving them the money, but also the huge amounts of support and capacity building so they could make real change in their community. And that sort of trust in people to do what is best for their community is something that works incredibly well. And lastly, I just want to talk about what I think you need to have in place in order for that local empowerment to happen. I think you need 4 things, and they're all mutually reinforcing of each other. Just one of these things alone isn't going to cut it. So firstly, you need active and mobilised citizens who have the skills and the confidence to take action on the things that really matter to them. And that's got to include increasing education, like civic education for our young people who have very little or none at the moment. We need to invest in community and civic institutions, including the physical and social infrastructure so people can come together, so they can meet, so they can talk, so they can organise together. We need to have opportunities from local government and the public sector agencies for people to get involved in the public policy decisions that affect their lives. And lastly, and I think most importantly, the thing that really has to change is that we have to have politicians at local and national level with the courage, with the imagination, with the will to empower their citizens. It's not a zero-sum game. There isn't a finite amount of power in the world. We just have to be brave enough to be able to share it with the people who have a stake in the future of their place.
Thank you, Miriam. Hi, Claire. You finally got here with the train. I was like, you can't have a session on devolution without a problem with the trains. It's like, you know, the universe helps us make our point, doesn't it? But listen, we heard from Andy Burnham, we've heard from Miriam, we've heard from Henri. I think Henri and Andy kind of shared quite a bit about the local government settlement and what's happening in terms of local government finances, and how do we have genuine devolution without more kind of fiscal devolution, but also that kind of devolving, basically being able to mend local government finances. And then Miriam, from that real kind of grassroots, how do we give communities more power? You've I guess you've worked from outside and inside politics, so we're quite keen to hear your perspective on where you see it next for devolution, but also any potential pointers where you think Labour may go as well on this agenda and issue.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I won't make any cracks about levelling up and train. So thank you for your patience. I think the question for me on devolution should always be, to whom are we transferring power and for what purpose? So not seeing devolution as an end in itself, but what does it enable us to do? And for me, the sort of core purposes are so that we have a more just economic growth across the country. And I know lots of people will sometimes balk at economic growth being the only the only sort of or primary goal. But I really think it is currently being, or it has potential to be redefined as we've known it probably for the last 30 or so years. And so I'll come back to that. But I think there is a huge opportunity, and Labour have been very specific about talking about economic growth across the country, rather than having a purely redistributed model, which absolutely has its place, that money is raised, money is contributed to and redistributed. That clearly has to be a huge part of our country. That we have more means to generate our own growth across the country in the multiple different ways that will mean. And it's not just the London and the South East model, it will look different in different places. So the primary thing is that contribution across the country, so we are all part of progress and prosperity. And the second purpose is, as Miriam touched on, really was about to whom, and it has to be ultimately about people in their own communities feeling like they have more control over their lives and what happens to them. It is not just about us transferring power from one group of politicians to another group of politicians, as much as I like some of them. It is definitely about how that is then transferred further down. And I think that's the sort of check that we always have to have about more powers, is who is this going to empower, who are you transferring power away from, and what's the effect of it going to be? So I do advocate for devolution, but I think you've always got to have those questions in mind. For me, real levelling up, and I think levelling up, it was a slogan, but I think it was, underneath it has the potential, and still has the potential, to be a really powerful transformative piece across the country. Firstly, I think it was transformative because to have a Conservative party making regional inequality their key domestic goal, I might have been cynical as a Labour supporter, but that was a big victory, frankly, for the kind of centrists amongst us who want to see regional inequality feature more strongly. But it also is that real platform for change and delivery, and I'm sure it will be picked over the course of the whole year in terms of what has and has not been delivered. But I much more want to see in the what has already happened that can be built upon by whichever government is elected, so that we actually have a proper strategic approach this time around. But the fact that regional inequality is now centre stage in political debate is no mean feat. And there isn't much that I thank Boris Johnson for, but the fact that he actually took up that mantle politically, and obviously he had predecessors in George Osborne and others, I think is really important, and we need to not overlook that. But what might be the kind of successor version? What's the legacy that it leaves us with in terms of those politics? That if there is a Labour government that is elected this year, what might that mean? And I hope it stops being a slogan and it actually is about a proper strategic approach across the country that is really underpinned by all of the kind of fundamental pillars that Labour has started to put down. So I think it requires, what does it require in practice? I think it's decision making and planning in particular to become not just housing planning, but skills, transport, employment services, all that planning closer to businesses, to local communities, and to local government, so they have a real say in shaping it. And we've got lots of really good examples of where that started to happen, but it's really uneven, and the infrastructure is really uneven to support it. So in Greater Manchester, we obviously have a very well developed, or Andy would say it's work in progress, but comparatively it's well developed. In York, we will have our first, North Yorkshire mayor. We will have a not mature system. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about not wanting to apply a blanket approach, because actually the infrastructure is not there to support devolution yet everywhere. It needs to be a kind of sequential process. We also need major infrastructure investment, and I think for Labour's setting out their green prosperity plan, which I know that there is some debate over the level that it should be, for me to be able to have a government that says we believe in borrowing up front in order to invest in the things that we need for the future, that should absolutely be part and parcel. There should be a cross-party consensus that is the thing to do. But we haven't got this approach to infrastructure, and I think having that longer term approach is extremely kind of needed. And it's not automatic, I think, that if you devolve, that the power then transfers to people. And part of my current role is with the Progressive Policy Institute, which is based in the US. But the same things that we're discussing here and the challenges that we have are underpinned by the same kind of analysis that you see in many, many other developed economies that have, in some places, more devolution than the UK, in some places have less devolution. In some places have more proportionate voting systems. Australia has, compulsory voting. There's lots of innovations. There's no developed economy that says we have got all these empowered citizens. They're all seeing declining trust, a lack of belief that government can actually work in their interests. So I just think we have to be a little bit careful in coming into the conversation and thinking that devolution or democratic engagement in and of itself will answer the fundamental question. I think those are primarily economic problems that we have not sorted out, are how we have a more just economy, and this is a consequence of it. So I think we are part of the solution, and we'll all argue whether we agree with PR or not, but we are not the totality of the solution. I think ultimately we have to have a kind of an economic settlement that works for working class people much better than it does currently, and greater devolution can be part of that. I think sort of thinking forward then about what we can expect from Labour, a lot of Labour's thinking was set out in the commission that Keir Starmer asked Gordon Brown to lead on, and it's a really wide-ranging commission. It's not Labour policy in the sense that that will come forward in manifesto, etc., and into government, but it does set out the kind of thinking that Labour's direction is going in, and a lot of that was about these economic clusters that were identified in the report. So a lot of the reporting was on things like House of Lords, etc. The bit that the Labour leadership were really, really interested in was this piece about kind of economic clusters, like how do we recognise the assets of every place, and how do we create the enabling environment for them to thrive? What powers are needed, and that might look different. But this is I think this is a real step change. I will continue to argue for that kind of investment at whatever level in this green prosperity plan. But there will be real pressures, and I think we have to not just think about what policy can we expect given to us from a Labour Party or a Conservative Party or a future government, but we have to think about what the tensions will be, because ultimately when you start to devolve some of those questions down to a local level, some of our theory unravels somewhat. We are not always at local level as big picture about planning and regulation. We are not actually always as good at practicing what we preach when it comes to some of those decisions. If a Labour government is elected nationally at a UK level, you may have places that have elected Labour at local level for their mayor and for their UK national government. And that is going to have to change the conversation that is currently happening between some of our elected mayors and some of our elected local government, and think about how the Scottish National Party will necessarily behave in Holyrood. How do we have a more mature dialogue that allows us to think about what is it we're trying to do as a country and how collectively do we try and get there. And that is what the missions that Labour brought out were in part aimed to address, which is to say, how do we get behind some central missions that we know we want to achieve as a country? I think actually this kind of adversarial dialogue that has frankly suited quite a lot of politicians in different places will have to end, because the public are frankly pretty sick of it. What I think I want us to see us move towards is a much more solutions focused approach, a more mature democracy, which is recognizing that actually some of this stuff is difficult. How do we get businesses involved in the conversation? How can the Welsh and Scottish government be an equal partner in those discussions? And how do the metro mayors really live up, I think, to the potential of what they could be? I think that also sort of finally has some challenges for us who are active in campaigning, because actually it means our dialogue needs to shift. If we do get a change of government, and that will be a huge step change after 14 years of, they will say it's many governments, but one party in power, how do we want to behave differently? How much do we want to be part of that solution? And I hope many of us see it as an opportunity, if there is a change of government, for us to think, how can we advance that argument around how you might devolve tax? How can we try and argue for some of the trade-offs that are needed? Because actually, I think if we are going to argue for more power to people, we have to become empowered ourselves to organise and be part of those solutions, rather than this sort of somewhat adversarial, but I think quite ineffective in a way, argument that we've had over the last few years. I think we've got an opportunity to do things differently. I hope that hope is coming, but don't expect power to be handed to you. Go and get it, and when you do get it, give it to somebody else.
Right, that could be our campaign slogan there. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the floor now. I'm sure you've got lots of questions. So again, I'll look for, I'd quite like to see some questions from younger people. Do we have some younger people in the room? Okay, yeah, I'll this person here in the green jumper first, this person here in the grey jumper, and no. In these events, the sort of younger becomes older and older though, doesn't it? And lastly, anyone else? Yeah, this gentleman here with the checkered shirt as well.
Thank you. Delighted to be a young person. I'm Julia from My Society. I suppose my question, Andy talks a lot about more powers to devolved regions, understandably, but I think that needs more effective scrutiny and public engagement. I think, Miriam, you talked a lot about this in a brilliant way, but across the panel would be keen to hear, what does effective scrutiny of mayors and combined authorities look like, especially combined authorities, which are just not understood by, I think, people on the whole, and how should people engage with that level of devolved government? Oh, sorry.
Should I? Thank you. Hi, I'm Peter from Democracy Club. I have a question about, so on the 2nd of May, every area of England and Wales is going to have an election. Every area of England and Wales is going to be voted for police and crime commissioners. Now that's a level of devolution that I don't think anyone has mentioned. Well, and so my question really, I think, and it kind of builds on the kind of warnings at the end, I think PCCs are possibly an example of a case that didn't really work, because if you think combined authorities aren't understood by the public, PCCs are just totally non-existent in their minds. What about PCCs? Should they still exist? And are there lessons to be learned from the Police and Crime Commissioner experiment?
Hi, thanks for a really interesting panel. Also very happy to be young. So I run a political literacy organisation, democratic education organisation, and I think claim to fame, I think I was the first person and maybe the only person to write learning resources on the GMCA. We do a lot of work on devolution. And there's a really big political literacy and engagement issue with devolution, and especially because there's these plurality of systems. So each system is slightly different. And I think it kind of builds on both of those points, but it is leading to not just a kind of an issue in terms of how do people engage, how do people, hold to account these different systems, especially when they're all different, but also this feeling that it's kind of an elite game for elite people that understand this extra level of government. So how do we kind of keep that the plurality of systems, but also boil it down to something that is kind of explainable and that people can engage with in a meaningful way?
We're chomping at the bit there on the PPC, so shall we come to you first, Henri?
I'm partly to blame. I was the person from the LGA when I was a local councillor who was on the Home Office implementation group for that, and it was obviously a complete and utter mess and done the first elections had to be held in November because the coalition, the Lib Dems, weren't going to do well in those elections, so they got the elections to be when no one was also voting, so it wouldn't depress their share of the vote in some local authority in the southwest. It was just a complete and utter disaster, basically. And so they started very badly. I mean, in the north of England, we've largely abolished them, right? So Oliver Coppard's getting police and crime powers. I think in the West Midlands, Andy Street has sort of very summarily got the government to just get rid of the police and crime commissioner when they come up for election. So in not the most participatory way or the most democratic way, we are largely abolishing them anyway, but they weren't brought in with any public consent anyway. So I suppose there's an argument of, well, do you mean kind of source of the poisonous tree? Do you mean they came in without anyone wanting them? But remember what they replaced. They replaced police authorities, and nobody knew who the chair of the police authority was. The police authority would select the chief constable. And look what's even worse, right? In London, I mean, the Home Office Secretary gets to decide who runs the policing in London. I mean, other than the Mayor of London, that's bonkers. So I think my point is police and crime commissioners, you might not like them, but they're better than all the alternatives we've thought up, apart from a mayor creating a deputy mayor for police and crime who has got the legitimacy and authority of the mayor because they have a big, decent, well understood mandate, but has the time to do it well. You look at the deputy mayor for police and crime in Greater Manchester, who's done a new one, doing a very good job. Do you mean the one in West Yorkshire I live does a pretty good job? No less visible than the directly elected version, but you halve the number of directly elected politicians because they essentially are kind of an adjunct to the mayor. But again, it doesn't help your problem, because one of the main differences between combined authorities is whether you have one with policing powers or not, and some of them are not coterminous. So Steve Rotherham will never be solved because the good people of one part of the Liverpool City region economically happen to have Cheshire Police. They don't want to have Merseyside Police because Cheshire Police will come round when you have a problem, whereas the Merseyside Police are busy dealing with serious organised crime because there's a lot more of that in Merseyside. So there are some unfortunate historical geographic issues which mean it's impossible to have coterminosity, but ideally you would have coterminosity and you would just get rid of them because we don't need both. And if we ever needed them, we certainly didn't need to have the elections in November so that it didn't upset the Lib Dems. Do you mean that was the start? Because that's why no one voted, because we did it in November, and the general election could be called at that sort of time of year, right? So have a think about what that does to turnout and participation, because it's a big problem with allowing people to have elections when it's really dark at 4:30 in the afternoon. That's a big problem. Never mind trust in politicians. That's also a problem. And I think my reflection on the use of citizens' juries, and I'm old enough, right, to be an advocate for double devolution when David Miliband was sort of still cool. So I've been drinking that Kool-Aid for a long time, and I agree with all of it. In practice, though, there are two barriers. People are doing it. So there's a citizens' jury at the moment on how we get to net zero in South Yorkshire, which I think is really interesting. And Oliver Coppard's doing some really interesting work in this space, probably the mayor that is most kind of making as much of this as anyone else. It's not that I don't think the other mayors are interested in participation. I just think Oliver's spent more time and energy on it. And I think that's probably an exemplar that others may choose to follow in time to go down that same route. My reflection would be, though, that I started off by talking about how local public services are broken and how that means everything else is broken. Do you mean people in my town in Ilkley are upset because last week we announced that we're not going to have a tip anymore? So they've started a local campaign to save the tip. Well, and I had this problem in local government, right? When I was trying to trade off, should we build houses in the green belt, or should we not have houses for people who are young and want to buy houses or want to rent houses? How do I represent the interests in that system? And I agree with what we want around a more participatory approach to local government. But when we are largely distributing money between sectional interests of middle-class people and poor children who are dying, how do we have that trade-off in a reasonable way? So I want the world you talk about, but if local government is living through austerity, the world you talk about doesn't exist. And it's why I'm not like don't talk about double devolution and the wonders of giving control to communities, because I tried to use it as a way to make the best of austerity and get people to take over libraries and try and make the best of a terrible world. But if all you're doing is engaging the community so that they can keep things running that you can't pay for anymore, that's a really crummy way to get people to participate in democracy. And I tried to do it and I couldn't make it work. I made it work a bit. Do you mean some people saved their libraries? They still exist now in the Northeast in Newcastle. I'm very proud of that. But that's not the best way to do it. So unless you can properly fund the local public state, be very careful what's about participation, what's about genuine public engagement, what's about kind of keeping things going that otherwise couldn't work. It's a dangerous game, because very soon, when you're at the sharp end, what you're actually doing is telling people either you run this or I'm closing it. And unfortunately, people don't want to run tips themselves. You could get them to run libraries themselves, but they won't run their own tips. And so when you get to that point of not having any money, all the theory and the double devolution stuff, which I love, is complete nonsense, because it just doesn't work. So you've got to be very careful how much you take the medicine you're prescribing, because it's the right medicine when there is real choice in public services. When there is no choice, when the local public state is broken, what you're talking about is blaming local councillors for things the government have done, bluntly. And I don't think that's very fair. I don't think it's right. And we need to have a proper grown-up debate about how we make sure that people who decide how much we fund local public services in Westminster are held accountable for local cuts, because no one in this room has yet suggested a solution to that problem. I'd love to hear it, because I've not found one yet. And it's really, really breaking local democracy, because people are trusting local councils less and less, because they have no conception that the local council listens to them, and that's because the local council has no money. So even the most participatory, the most inclusive local authorities are still broken in this environment in terms of how they can engage their public. Because we did council pounds, we did get the public involved in how we spend our money, but when there's no money, there's no choice. The council pound is adult services, children's services, and nothing else. So how do you consult on that? How do you go out and say, well, we're going to fund these things that stop people dying, and we've got no money for anything else? How do you do that? It's really difficult. And I love what you're saying, but in practice, in some parts of the country, in the poorest areas, it is completely irrelevant, because the world is just completely broken. And there is no choice. And when there's no choice, you can't include people in prioritisation, because there are no priorities to set.
Okay, Henri, so I'm sure you're biting at the bit to come back at that, Miriam. So what do you think?
So I don't disagree that you need a decent financial settlement, as you said as well, Claire, in order to fund local authorities properly. Do I think that means you can't engage people in that process? No. No, I think you're talking about two completely different things. When local authorities have to make these terrible, terrible decisions, is it not better to do that with people than just make it happen in a very closed room where people don't know what's happening? They don't know the decisions that's being made. They don't understand why it's being made, because there's very little communication outwards. To actually involve people in those really difficult and hard trade-offs in a way that brings a representative group of your local residents into the room, exactly as citizens' assemblies do. You don't just get the sharp-elbowed people who are just going to always be in those rooms and kind of demanding the power that they've always had to not build on the green belt or whatever that particular issue is. It's absolutely about getting all those representative voices of people who are never in the room, who never have the chance to say, you know what, sod the green belt, I really need a house for my kids to move into. You've got to have those voices in the room as councils are making those incredibly difficult decisions. So you take people with you and you trust that people are really fair. And that's one thing about the British public that we know from all the citizens' assemblies that have been run on pretty much any single process you want to name. People are really fair, and they actually really want to make a country that works for everybody, for the common good. And trusting people to do that will help local authorities. It's about doing this with local authorities, not local authorities essentially being kind of barricaded in a small room, having to make these incredibly hard choices. You work with your local population, you work with them to campaign for more money from central government to local authorities. That's only going to help everybody, but you have to take people with you.
Claire Ainsley, would you like to comment on any of the questions or on this quite heated debate and interesting that we're having around kind of power to local governments and the financial settlement?
I suppose back on this question about kind of what people understand and what their experience is of when they vote or they speak up, what happens? Does anything change? And I'm not in favour of creating really any more structures. I'd far rather simplify structures and rather than create loads more structures. So to the point about police and crime commissioners, I think where it's possible to consolidate powers, it's much easier to do that, because if you've got to think about things from the citizens' point of view, and I don't mean the sort of citizens who are already really engaged and really active and are campaigning, but are the people for whom should have absolute equality for the people who do choose to exercise their voice in other ways, who maybe aren't voting at all, or who don't really believe their vote's going to make a difference. Like, their job is not to understand our world better. Our job is to make politics translate better for those people. And I don't think we do that by setting up more complicated architecture, which will also be really expensive, et cetera, et cetera. I really believe, and I'm sure we all are saying that we believe in good citizen engagement. I just think partly what we can learn from the lessons of the last few years is, and from the innovations that local authorities, devolved governments are taking on, is, where do citizens' juries work really well? Where do citizens' assemblies work really well? What does really great citizen engagement look like? And how do we choose the best method? I mean, none of us here are arguing for like bad local authority engagement with the community. I think the argument is more, how do you select how to do this well and how to do it meaningfully, and how do you enable that to happen in local government? Because I think when you're on the other side of power, so if you've been a campaigner and you go into central government or into local government, so much of the time you are reacting to the circumstances that you find yourself in. And partly, sorry to sort of hark back to these missions, but partly the aim of that is a recognition that unless we try and think as a country, what are our common goals? Where do we want to get to? And what is all of our role in helping to deliver that? These really quite thin, rundown structures, and I include central government in some of that, are not able to meet some of those longer term goals. And it's not, I don't think, sometimes through lack of will or desire. Much of it is because people are just constantly firefighting and then thinking, oh God, we thought the budget deficit was bad. Now we found out we've got this huge issue with asbestos or, schools, what have you. And now we're sort of running to stay on track. So I don't feel depressed about that. I just think it means we have to take a deep breath and think about how we do government differently. But that is also how we do the citizen engagement part of it differently. And rather than just shouting at government and wanting them to change the way they behave as if somehow they are victims of their own circumstance often, we need to, I think, organise ourselves better, and also ask our own organisations how we are being more inclusive, more democratic, and how we're bringing more people with us, because otherwise I just feel like we're going to be locked in this sort of campaigners versus local government, and you change the party, but nothing actually fundamentally changes. I think we've got to have a more engaged citizenry, and that's on us as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to open it up to more questions. Again, I'd like to see some diversity in people answer. Oh, you don't have to, but I'll try and prioritise if that's okay. And this lady here in the red cardigan, I love that cardigan. The gentleman next to you in the red. I'm basically just going for people who are dressed in red on this one, aren't I? And the lady here in the orange and red scarf. And one from online. Is there someone online who's wanting a question? Yeah, okay. What I will say is that we keep your comments really brief. We do just have this last round of questions in 15 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Caroline from the Structural Inequalities Alliance. And it's not a question, it's just a comment that I think we need to increase democracy in all of our institutions so that when we're making those really tough decisions, it isn't just on the government, because if you're prioritizing social care often doesn't work because it's not engaging the people that it is serving, and those most affected by policies should be at the heart of policy making.
Peter Hurst, do the panelists agree that although fiscal devolution is an essential part of the devolution settlement, it and also public infrastructure won't work properly? Because remember, the only time that most voters actually connect is when they vote. And it's so essential to get the elementary system of voting better and build that, what I would call a democratic infrastructure, which I agree with Andy, that the Constitution is part of that we can't just ignore that. That has to be an integral part of devolution.
Hi, Laurie Moulton from the Zero Campaign for the Cross-Party Climate and Ecology Bill. Getting back to Andy and Henry's point, I mean, regardless of who wins the next election, I mean, the economic situation is horrendous. Local councils are on the front line and are being basically thrown under the bus. Is there any way, you know, devolution, structure, constitutional changes? I mean, that's a multi-year issue. Is there any way of engaging the local public to support the local councils in getting some selective improvements and changes in terms of power and funding? Is that being considered potentially as a possible stop break? Because otherwise the system's going to break. People don't care if local councillors or national politicians, they don't give a damn. Totally lose any legitimacy, and then it's going to be very difficult.
And the question online.
Hello, can you hear me? Charlie Mansell. My impression is that Rachel Reeves is up for a degree of fiscal devolution to English local government, but we also know the Treasury will in general resist this based on its history. So a practical question for you, is there a trade-off here between more radical fiscal devolution in return for the Treasury in partnership with SITFA having a more professional leadership role over the finance departments of English local government, and perhaps even bringing in the finance departments of the 42 English integrated healthcare systems, making them more accountable to local government too?
Thank you, Charlie. Okay, so this time I think I'll start from Claire and we'll go this way. And just to say, this will be the sort of final rounds of like responses to the questions and also sort of summary comments. So if you want to do a general summary, you've got about 3 minutes, or you can answer any of those specific questions.
Thank you. I think the questions on fiscal devolution are really pertinent, because I think it's not just the Treasury that will be a barrier. I think it's also political reality. I think the difficulty you have is, elected devolved politicians will want to have more fiscal devolution, and I can certainly see like the merits for it. When voters come to vote, in the end, they tend to blame, rightly or wrongly, the national government, and that is something that we have to think really carefully about how we would do in this country. So ultimately, I would like to see us have more fiscal devolution, but I agree with the gentleman in the audience and the question online that you have to pack around that mechanisms to ensure that that is actually accountably held at the right level, because we see in so many areas where that isn't where people hold politicians to account. So whether it's Rachel Reeves or any other chancellor or shadow chancellor, even if they are personally sympathetic to the benefits that fiscal devolution can bring, I think we would have to demonstrate how you have that democratic link. Otherwise, kind of what are we arguing for? We're arguing for something which then feels very opaque and quite elitist, and that isn't, I think, where we're coming from. So I think we're getting to a point where there is more political support for it, and that's a good thing. I hope what we see in the next phase of government is this sort of maturing of the kind of combined authorities and metro mayor levels in England, combined with greater devolution. And then some of these questions will be robustly put by Andy Burnham and others, and hopefully they will be part of the answer of working through some of those questions with a future government. I think sort of the real point about local government finances is I do want good local governments who engage citizens well. I really want a settlement on social care that stops local authorities essentially having to fall into being the administrators of a system that doesn't work whatsoever. So I think that unless that question can be cracked, in a sense, local government is constantly being pushed to the margins of what is becoming the managers of that system. And that is not what most of those local councillors will have ever gone into it for. It's not what they want. It's certainly not the best thing for our social care residents who deserve and want the better system, and for our social care workers. I feel that, and stating the, flipping obvious, but, the pandemic, we have not, as a country, faced up to the emotional, practical, economic and health consequences of that pandemic. We have come out of that pandemic on the whole going, phew. And that is not what's happening. It's not happening what's happening in our schools, for our young children, from our care homes. So the more we delay that pain of facing up to that, the more we are going to have consequences to feel. So I think we have got I think we've got a big reckoning, and I think that social care is absolutely core to that. I don't really think that improving local government is the starting point for it. I think it has to be part of it, but I think it is a national conversation we have to do, which is we have to front up what happened in that pandemic and be honest about the lessons that we've learned from it, and about the kind of the human grief and pain that has been caused by it. And then think about what do we want to do differently? And if that ever pandemic or something like that ever hit again, how might we do it differently? Because how we treated our young people and how we treated our older people and disabled people, I hope we never have to put them through that again. So I think we can look to the future, but I think we've got to do some hard questions about what the last few years have been like. And I think that actually citizen assemblies and others can be ways of doing that. But I think that local authorities are under immense pressure. And as I've said several times, I think responsibility is on all of us. And I hope we see a bit of a change this year that makes us feel like we can contribute to that a bit more positively than perhaps some of us have felt over the last few years.
I mean, thank you for the question from the gentleman. I thought it was really interesting about the nature of how this works. And I think if you think about kind of picking up that theme of the pandemic, the nature and the scale of Andy's victory in Greater Manchester, right, very large personal mandate, was a response to the fact that people felt that his performance during the pandemic had been something they approved of, right? Largely, whether it be hospitality business, whoever else, they thought he was doing a good job. And it's why I'm concerned about losing AV for the mayoral system, for the much underloved PCC system, and for English metro mayors, which is I have a concern about majoritarianism and not having a legitimate mandate for the sort of power I would like these people to have, with all the checks and balances, which we didn't come on to in that last round of questions about combined authorities and how they work. Because my argument would be the mayoral model has a lot more checks and balances out of London than it does in London, because the council leaders of London have no power to be a check or balance on Sadiq or whoever the mayor was decisions. That isn't the case. Andy Burnham cannot just do what he wants in Greater Manchester. He has to convince a group of, at times, but not always, but cross-party leaders. It has been at times, and I think it still is now. But theoretically, in some areas, it's a Labour group of leaders in Birmingham and a Tory mayor. Has been, at least when he first got elected, it was largely Labour leaders. So, and I think my one point, come back to your question from earlier, because I never properly answered it, so I went on a bit of a tangent, is that the scrutiny arrangements, both in local government and in combined authorities, are relatively weak. And someone who used to chair a scrutiny panel in my dim and distant past, I took it very seriously. Most people in local government don't. You need to find how do you value and take seriously the scrutiny and challenge role in local government and in combined authorities. Answers on a sort of back of a sheet of paper. I don't have loads of them, but you need to value it and make it more important and give it more teeth, really. So I think you probably argue the more powers, and I think one of the things the government's got wrong is they want MPs to be able to question Andy every year as part of his level 4 deal. Like, no, do you mean that's irrelevant? If you're an MP, you can just ring Andy Burnham any day of the week. Do you mean he does not talk to the MPs in Greater Manchester? Why do you have to have some sort of grand committee? Why not make the scrutiny arrangements that were already there, that are local politicians who are not the leaders of their councils, but often from the opposition groups in Greater Manchester, much more effective review? So don't use MPs for it, use local councillors, but do it a lot better. And I think the point I'm sort of trying to make, and why I link the two together, is that I do think Andy has legitimacy, which is why you can give him more power. But the problem is, at the moment, he's spending other people's magic beans. So like when Andy doesn't have enough money, you can just ring up the Treasury and go, you didn't give me enough money, I need more money. And that's going to be even worse when it's a Labour government. They're going to go, we haven't got any more money, put the phone down. Like, you've got to tell these mayors how they can get their own money. And yes, some of their money may still come from central redistribution, but they have to have some responsibility. And actually in London, business rates paid for half of Crossrail. Business rates pays largely for free school meals, something London has and no one else has for primary school kids universally. Brilliant policy, and an example of, now taxing business is always easy. It gets harder when you start doing other things like increasing the national insurance rate, for example, to pay for stuff you need. That's harder to do, but we need to get to that point where we can have that debate. Do you mean they have tax raising powers in Scotland? I see no reason why in 10, 20 years we will not have different taxation arrangements in different places to pay for what people are voting for. And I think, to come back to the lady's question about care experienced people and the nature of how we make decisions about the most disempowered, I absolutely agree with that argument. And I suppose the argument I was trying to make was, at the moment, local participation often comes at the expense of the most marginalised in society, who struggle to be listened to and organise themselves. Now, that doesn't mean they can't have support to organise themselves, but my experience in local government was that when we did engagement, it was very hard to get the voices, as you rightly argue, of the person who can't afford to get on the housing ladder or can't get a council house. it was very loud when people turned up with a coffin full of turf and said that I was going to ruin their lives because I was building houses like 2 miles from where they lived, but they just didn't like the principle. There'd be more people in their little bit. Do you mean the urban extension that will come after the one they live in, right? Because the biggest proponents or objectors to building on the Greenbelt are people who live in houses that were once built on the Greenbelt. Do you mean that's the irony that every local councillor who's ever worked in this area ever always has, the people who hate development on the Greenbelt, the most people whose houses were most recently built on the Greenbelt, because they're the people with a view. People with a view are the people who hate you. That's the basic economics and sort of politics of it. It's not very complicated. So I would like to get to that more evolved way of engaging the wider public. And I think in affairs of kind of what we do about the future, which is why I was saying that citizens' assemblies particularly seem to be working very well around things like the net zero transition, is when there are real choices, when there's real money, and a future Labour government might be giving a lot more real money for local leaders to decide how to spend. That is exactly where you can make participation work. I suppose my argument before, and I wasn't coming to a group of people who work in the democracy sector, arguing against the democracy sector, is that it's very hard to do it effectively when there are no real choices. Because you can only engage the public, unless you're trying to just turf onto them the responsibility for running services that used to be publicly funded. The only way you can do it really effectively is when there is actually choice, real choice over how to spend public money. And I want to bring that back to local government. I want local government not simply to be like sort of indirect cuts to public services mechanism, which is what they have largely become for central government. We've got to fix that. And I think if you look at what Labour's proposing around the Green Investment Fund, however big it ends up being, and I don't think it's really about the number, it's about the principle of doing it, a lot of that should be deployed locally by mayors, by local government. That is the answer to your question. Do you mean that money should not be centrally spent by Ed Miliband, whoever it is? Largely, it could and should be devolved. And if you did things like devolve, for example, national insurance, as we've argued as at the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, to local government or to mayors for different purposes, you can then borrow against that money locally off the balance sheet. So Treasury is obsessed with the problems of their own fiscal rules creation, which is that we won't borrow for anything unless it's going to cut the deficit next week. And in reality, we end up spending money in such a way that we're making the deficit much bigger. And the OBR will tell you the deficit will be 200% of GDP, by the way, in the 2040s and 50s, because we're not investing in the long-term things we need. You need to fix those fiscal rules, but you also need to think about how can you give local government its own revenue streams that they can themselves borrow against. And then it's completely outside the scope of these discussions, because it's about, can local government raise that money itself, rather than can they ask central government for more because they've spent all their allowance. That whole dynamic has to be fixed, because as long as mayors are just spending someone else's money, you can never, because you'd have to take all the pain at national level and you're giving all the sweeties to the local level. Do you mean it doesn't matter how evolved a chancellor or politician at nationally you are, you're never going to do that. If it's Andy Burnham's own money, he has to justify why he's putting taxes up to spend it, then central government will become a lot more relaxed. And that is the one flaw of the current model, is we've given the power to spend without the power to raise funds, and without a proper mechanism in the form of a local government finance settlement that works to redistribute money around the country so that it's fair. We haven't made any of that work. And so you can't just layer on any more powers or responsibilities or money without making more of the responsibility for raising it sit with those politicians, because it just doesn't, the system is fundamentally flawed, because it will always lead to a local leader saying, I just need more money. And you can't make real trade-offs actually, or be a grown-up politician. Really, you're being kept as a child, because you never have to make the hard choice, because whenever you don't have enough money for something, you don't go, I'll prioritize that. You go, oh, I'll ring the Treasury and blame them. And that's not how mature politics has or should or could work. We have to have a more grown-up settlement around how that works.
Thank you so much, Henry. And finally, Miriam.
I'll keep it brief. It's lunchtime. The question that you asked about social care and involving the people who are actually in receipt of those services in the design and delivery of those services. Yeah, absolutely. You can't be designing systems without the people who are going to be like receiving them, bearing the brunt of them. They know the pain of the broken system. They've got to be part of the solution to coming up with making it work a little bit better. I think there's a bigger conversation that needs to be had about how we fund social care. It is unfunded. It's a personal burden, not a state burden at the moment. But I think that's exactly where really good participation and engagement has to be part of it. It's a national conversation that we need to have about what people, kind of how people want to create the system that's actually going to work and how it needs to be paid for. It's so difficult. That financial decision is so massive and so been kind of kicked into the long grass by successive governments for decades and decades and decades. The only way to crack it, I think, is to make kind of the population of the country part of that conversation and take people with you as you make potentially really difficult choices about raising taxes, putting money on national insurance. kind of putting in a social insurance model, whatever it is, we've got to do that with people to make it doable. Then the last point I wanted to make was actually kind of to the gentleman's point there, that fiscal devolution won't matter a damn if we don't have the right democratic structures in place and the right kind of processes that are going to take people with you in that. And I think that comes back to something that I thought that Andy Burnham said that I thought was really excellent, where he said democratic rewiring is a first order issue. And I completely agree with that. Unless we've got the ways and means of people getting really engaged and involved in decisions that affect their everyday lives, so they really kind of build back up that trust in our democratic systems, in our politicians, in our politics, in our political institutions, I'm really afraid of what's coming down the line. So we have to tackle that first. And I think it is a massive trust issue. It's about rebuilding trust and faith in those institutions. But really critically, I think it's also about politicians and those with power at the moment trusting people to make good and fair and right decisions for the good of the country.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let me hear it once again for such a fascinating, inspiring and challenging panel. I loved it. Thank you.